This is really thrilling to see so many people at our very first Poet and Science Cafe. This is actually the kickoff to a pretty big project that we're doing here at the museum. And it's a collaboration called, as the sign says, Fieldwork Aligning Poetry and Science. It is a collaboration project of the Salt Lake City Library, Poets House, which is a poetry library in New York City, Catherine Coles, our poet in residence on the project, and also a wonderful former Utah poet laureate, and of course us, the Natural History Museum of Utah. The program was generously funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, we call it IMLS, and it's actually a multi-city pilot program. The idea is that what's happening here tonight and through the rest of the year is also happening in its own way in Milwaukee. And this is a test to see the ways in which we're able to foster STEM learning, what we call STEM learning, science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM learning through language arts experiments. To help us learn about what we're learning, can you please fill out one of the little evaluation surveys at the end of the evening before you go? That will really help the big team that's trying to figure out, how does this work? Can we bring poetry together and science together and make some magic? And can we replicate this? Yeah, big test tonight. And can we replicate this in many cities across the country? So it's us in Milwaukee, each doing it in our own way. So there are many more exciting projects coming up over the course of the year. Here, some at the library, at various locations, right? Various locations at the library, and also through your own journeys. So some of you probably picked up the field guides as you came in the door, and those are really an invitation for you to discover science and poetry all around the city and the local region. Also, you can join us here for our second Science and Poetry Cafe on October 24th, and then watch both of our websites, the Salt Lake City Library and the Natural History Museum of Utah, for upcoming events. Things will go on all the way through next summer. So, on to tonight's event. We invited 4 experts tonight to join forces to speak to us in the language of science and poetry. They're speaking on 2 different topics, and they're taking their own voice and their own language to speak to us in that way. First up is Randy Ermis and Michael Souder. Randy is the Natural History Museum of Utah's chief curator, and he's a paleontology curator here. His research asks how vertebrate animals living on land evolved through deep time, and particularly in response to climate change and other events. He has been recognized with many academic awards and honors throughout his career. Michael Souder is a professor of English and Religious Studies at Utah State University. His writing explores themes of wilderness, fatherhood, Buddhism, yoga, spirituality. His work has appeared in American Life in Poetry, 5 Points, Shambhala Sun, Lion's Roar, Green Mountains Review, and the New York Times Online, and more. Then, following those 2 and their discussion, sorry, not their discussion, their presentations, got to keep this in the 3 parts that it's occurring. Next up after them will be Shannon Arnold Boomgarden and Paisley Reckdahl. Dr. Boomgarden is Assistant Director of the Range Creek Research Field Station here in Utah, and also the Director of the Department of Anthropology's Archaeological Field School at the University of Utah. She began working in archaeology nearly 20 years ago and has been involved at Range Creek since the early 2000s. If any of you have been there, that is an amazing place. Paisley Reckdahl is the author of 5 books of poetry, 3 works of nonfiction. Her work has received the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an NEA Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and various state arts and Arts Council awards, and she teaches here at the University of Utah. She is Utah's Poet Laureate. So after each of these pairs of experts give their presentations, they'll then step to the front and have a conversation among themselves and with all of you. So for now, for this first round, please help me in welcoming our first 2 speakers.
Well, thank you for that fantastic introduction. Really appreciate it, Becky, and thank you to everyone who organized this event, and especially to the other experts who are joining in this grand adventure, and to all of you for joining us this evening. As a paleontologist, we really quickly started talking, Michael and I, about the idea of fossilization and fossils and what that means in different contexts. And I think there's some really cool connections between the concept of a fossil in science, but also in language and literature. And so this, is the most basic thing from looking at definitions. You can just look at a definition where we have the scientific definition of a fossil, something that's a trace of a previous living organism from a former geologic time. Whereas a fossil can also be a word or linguistic form that has become obsolete except in particular phrases, idioms, or regions. But we were exploring this in a much deeper sense. And there are some really amazing scientific connections, which I wish I could go into in detail, but in the way that we actually study both language and paleontology. So when we create an evolutionary tree or a family tree of how different species from the geologic past are related, we actually use the same methods as we do for dinosaurs to create this branching diagram of relationships that we do with languages. The very exact same methods are used. And so there's a really cool connection between language and fossils and organisms there. But I wanted to sort of think about it more on sort of why we get excited about paleontology and poetry and literature. And I think a big part of that is through discovery, right? That is, when we're digging up a fossil, for example, you're the first person ever to find that fossil and see it and get some sort of reaction to it. In the same way that when you read a poem or you read a novel, you have that reaction of having an unusual, or having a unique reaction to what you're reading that no one else has in quite the same way. And so I think that sense of discovery certainly crosses over in both of our fields. Another thing is this idea that both poems and fossils reveal lost worlds. That is, that fossil or the poem encapsulates a certain time in that author's history or what they were thinking, and is something that's brought forward to the present in that interaction. In the same way that someone studying bones fossil bones can, reconstruct an entire lost world of what this animal looked like, and with the context of those fossils, understand what sort of world this animal was living in. And so I think literature and poetry in particular, and fossils do that, a very similar thing in transporting, whether it's the scientist or the reader, back in time or forward in time, as it might be. And specifically, I think there's this way of making connections with the past, whether it be through poetry or fossils, is really, really powerful. And I really like this painting here by William Dyce. It's of his family collecting fossils along the seashore of Kent in 19th century England. And so, those fossils have a connection to the ancient past because they tell a story about what life was like when those chalk cliffs were deposited back in the Cretaceous. But then moving forward from the time that fossil was collected to now, there's also that history, that connection with the past of the people who collected it, the people who studied the fossil, and that whole human history that's associated with a specimen. And I think that's sort of exemplified by looking at art and literature as well, where you have both that connection with the original author sometime in the past, but also new insights that, as a reader, you get from reading that literature and those poems. And so I wanted to give one particular example from research that we've been doing here that has this history of a very long history and a really cool story, and that has that connection to the ancient past, but also to sort of the last 160 years here in the American West. And it relates to the 1859 Macomb Expedition. This was a expedition, an Army expedition that was given the goal of finding the confluence of the Green and Colorado rivers and charting much of the old Spanish trail system and the area around the confluence. And they did a lot of work. They had cartographers, they had artists with them. This is a picture of what's now known as Indian Creek with the Abajo Mountains in the background. And they had a naturalist with them named John Newberry, who was a paleontologist and geologist, and he did a lot of work. And on August 17th in 1859, he found some bones in a cliff south of Moab. And one of my favorite parts is that he always refers to himself in third person in his own journal, Dr. Newberry, yeah, as if he has to be so formal with himself. So. But very matter of fact, find bones in cliff. And then the next day, return to examine those bones and try and collect some of them. This is from another member of the party, C.H. Dimmick. And on their way back, after they'd gone to what they thought was the confluence, they got pretty close, but they may not have gotten right down to the shoreline. Newberry was given a day, basically, to excavate what he could of the fossil bones. And again, here he is talking about himself in the third person and just saying, we excavated as many bones as we could and got back to camp at 11 p.m. And I love it because you can contrast that with Dimmick, who says he went to take another pick at the old petrified monster, and they did not return until 10 p.m., which gives us great uneasiness. So you can imagine if you've been out in the wilds, someone goes off hiking and they don't return until after dark, you start to get worried. So I really appreciate that. Because of the Civil War, although the map they created was published in 1860, the actual expedition report did not get published until the 1870s because the Civil War intervened. And in it, Newberry has this great passage where he says, basically, we didn't have the right tools to get the rest of the skeleton out, and the special object of our efforts still remains to reward some future geologist who shall visit this interesting locality with more time and better tools, basically. A year later, famous paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope gave a name to this animal, Dystrophaeus via male, and via male means bad road, which must be some reference to the party's troubles. But also, these are some early illustrations of the bones, and he recognized they were some sort of dinosaurian reptile. But after that, not much work was done. In 1904, another paleontologist recognized it was a type of dinosaur called a sauropod, one of these really long-necked, long-tailed, plant-eating dinosaurs. But after that, no science was done. Until the 1970s, a local historian named Fran Barnes started to try and retrace the Macomb Expedition route, and he actually successfully relocated the site. And paleontologists visited the site in 1989 and collected a few scraps. But they were unable to really do much work because it was so hard to get to the site. And so it wasn't until 2014 that our team, as well, in collaboration with John Foster from the Museum of Moab, were silly enough to try and excavate the rest of the site and make good on that promise that Newberry talked about in his report about some future geologist finding the rest of the skeleton. And we found all sorts of bones from parts of the tail. Here's a part of that tail. I've got this original bone with me that we can look at during the discussion. Parts of the backbone here. These are still embedded in rock. And so we have this great connection. Not only are we reconstructing what this animal looked like back 150 million years ago, but we're making the connection 160 years ago with Macomb and Newberry and their team. And we can get new information from these old bones, so extracting new discoveries from these time capsules, whether it be this tooth on the far left, we actually were able to micro CT scan and digitally extract it. This was something that was collected in 1989. And then even the fossils collected by Newberry back in 1859, we're now applying new techniques to gather new information. And so it's really connecting us back with the original scientists and party members, but also back with this lost world. Here we've CT scanning a leg bone that Newberry collected in 1859, and this is at the Smithsonian. And now we have, a really cool 3D model with information on the interior of the bone, whatnot, that we can use for research. So I thought, this is a great example of how like literature and particularly poems, there's this connection, as this is a time capsule of what happened in the past, but also a connection with the author. When we study fossils, we have that time capsule in terms of reconstructing ancient worlds, but we also get that connection with the scientists and other people who studied those fossils before us. So thank you so much, and I'd like to now turn it over to Michael for his part.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I shouldn't close this computer, right? No. Okay. All right, cool. Great. Thank you all for coming out this evening. It's so fun to be down here. I'm down here from Logan, Utah State. I just like to thank a few people. I just want to say it's a really honor for me to be here with these other distinguished guests. I think I'm here with 3 Utah Poet Laureates, so that's like really impressive. I'd like to thank Catherine Coles for inviting me to be here, and Dr. Randy Ermis for educating me and showing me a backstage tour of the museum. Colleen McLaughlin, I think, yes, for making all the arrangements, and Poets House of New York and the museum itself for hosting us. So I'm going to begin with a poem by Robinson Jeffers, and then I'm going to have some just thoughts about how poets are like paleontologists, and then I have a poem of my own at the end, okay? So this is a poem by Robinson Jeffers. He was a great 20th century environmentalist poet and kind of a part-time misanthrope. And I'm not sure if you have to be a misanthrope to be an environmentalist, but it could help, I'm not sure. Anyway, this is called Carmel Point. The extraordinary patience of things, this beautiful place, defaced with a crop of suburban houses. How beautiful when we first beheld it. Unbroken field of poppy and lupin, walled with clean cliffs. No intrusion but 2 or 3 horses pasturing, or a few milch cows rubbing their flanks on the outcrop rockheads. Now the spoiler has come. Does this place care? Not faintly. It has all time. It knows the people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb, and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of pristine beauty lives in the very grain of granite, safe as the endless ocean that climbs our cliff. As for us, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. So a few weeks ago, I met Randy Ermis when he had just returned home from a dig in the Needle section of Canyonlands National Park, working in the Chinle stratum of rock. There, among other things, he and his team found the edges of a large skull and cut out a huge block of rock to transport it home. On the day I met him, Randy gave me a backstage tour of the museum where white-coated professionals and volunteer paleontologists worked at tables separating fossils from their encasing rock. I was stilled by the exquisite care and patience with which they worked. Randy showed me the petrified remains of so many creatures, great and small, lost, extinct, and I kept thinking about what they had to say to us, what meanings they carried. Each fossil named, cataloged, cared for, their messages interpreted by Randy and other scientists. And I also kept thinking about ways that poets are like paleontologists. The American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that words are fossil poetry. If you take a word, say a big abstract word, and dig up its roots, you'll find in its history an image, a poem, a story. Take a word like contemplation, which seems like a big abstract word. You can't see contemplation or touch contemplation, but inside it is a fossil word that tells a story. Contemplation is built from the word templum, a dead word from a dead language. In ancient Rome, priests conducted ceremonies, made vigils at the top of consecrated hills, sacred spaces called templums. They waited for signs from the skies, portents, eagles. They performed divination by observing the flight of birds. A templum was a place where humans, through their augurs, interacted with the gods. Templum gave us the word temple. So when we sit in contemplation in a church or a temple or on a cliff, we're like the ancient priests on a templum looking to the skies for signs, for birds, the descendants of dinosaurs. Our everyday language is full of such word fossils, usually unnoticed in the sediment of ordinary usage. Poets dig up dead words, forgotten roots, and reinvigorate them, make them speak again, bring new meanings into language, into consciousness. As with the fossils of lost creatures, these language fossils also have a story to tell. And not only these dead words, but poems themselves often have fossil-like lives. The poet Ed Hirsch visited our campus up in Logan last year, and in a talk he compared a poem to a time capsule, a message in a bottle. Someone writes a poem and it's collected in a book. The poem may sit in the book unread for 100 years, and then some reader browsing the shelves, some of us still browse shelves, pulls the book down, turns to the poem by chance, and the poem blossoms with meaning. Buried for 100 years, it comes to life. In a small space, poems embody traces of lives, whole cultures. The stories such word fossils tell can even alter our interpretations of history. In the late 18th century in Bengal, India, a British colonial Supreme Court Justice, Sir William Jones, fell in love with Indian language and culture. A linguist, he began teaching himself Sanskrit, the ancient sacred language of the subcontinent. As he began his studies, he encountered Sanskrit words uncannily similar to Greek and Latin words, mater, meter, matar, pater, pater, pitar. He found hundreds. Jones realized that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and hence nearly all of Europe's languages must have been a part of one ancestor mother tongue, one that is now called the Indo-European language family. On the basis of these fossil words from 3 dead languages, Jones realized that these pagan Indians whom he was sent to colonize and convert were in fact already his brothers and sisters, all part of the same family. So here's my poem. It's called These Bones. These bones are not bones. Mandible, scapula, humerus, vertebrae, skull, they are rock, only rock. Detritus, limbs left as creatures left the earth, buried, dismantled in mud, ash, sediment. They become the earth itself, dust to dust, lost and found. In the laboratory, workers bend over stone with brushes, chisels, drills, tiny jackhammers to read the words in the sepulchre rock, rock of ages, endlessly rocking out of extinction, brought back, if not to life, to us, these bones that are not bones. The ancient Chinese called them dragons, the Greeks cyclops, gorgons, manticores, hydras. What are they to us? these resurrected monsters, reconstructed, standing in vaulted rooms, or tiny brachiopods in boxes and drawers, or tubes and ridges, remnants of microbes deposited at undersea vents 3.5 billion years ago. We look back. We give them names. They sit quiet as stone. This femur, tall as a pillar, like Lot's wife, who looked back for a glimpse of a world that was gone. Bones that are not bones, sometimes just prints, fossils of air, of absence. Before Alexander came to India, no one carved Shakyamuni Buddha in bodily form. Before the Greeks and their love of the physical body, images of the Buddha were aniconic, an empty throne, empty footprints carved in stone for the one who was gone. The one whose sutra says, form is no other than emptiness, emptiness no other than form. We know that this podium, this body, is mostly empty space. And what isn't space, those quantum particles, what exactly and where exactly are they? Shiva is the destroyer of the world. Mediterranean eruptions, a giant meteor smashing the Yucatan. Shiva wipes the beach clean that the world may begin again. What can these bones that are not bones say to us, who stand knee-deep in the rising tide of the sixth great mass extinction? To us who have no ark to board with brother and sister species to a new shore, there is no other shore. One thing the fossils say is that the earth wants to go on, to unfold in new myriad forms, to flower, clematis unfolding in the wet garden. And when we lay our bodies down, may we too turn to stone, or leave a mark on a wall, a monument, or a poem to say that we too were here on the earth. And may you, who find our fossils, who live in a new world, may you learn to care in ways that we forgot. Thank you.
All right. I also want to thank the organizers and thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about this. When I signed up for this collaboration, I knew I wanted to tell you about Range Creek Canyon and the research that the staff and students of the Range Creek Field Station have been conducting over the last 16 years. In Range Creek, we study the Fremont farmers who struggled to make a living in this rugged, semi-arid environment over 1,000 years ago. And we've recorded nearly 500 prehistoric archaeological sites in the canyon since 2002. So I thought, what can I share in only 10 minutes that touches on years of field work and that a poet might also find interesting to talk about? After meeting, we agreed on something that I think inspires nearly everyone who sees it, and that is prehistoric rock art. It was suggested to me early on in this experience that I should leave my comfort zone. So I'm going to admit something right now. Rock art is one of my least favorite subjects to talk about. And it's not because I don't love rock art. I enjoy looking at it and imagining all the possible interpretations as much as anyone. But as an archaeologist, I am always asked, what does it mean? And my answer is almost always, I don't know. And that's not something many academics like to say, but I really don't know. And I don't want to make up any stories or make my best guess. As a scientist, I strive to gather data, look for patterning, and test hypotheses. So when I include rock art in a lecture, it tends to be a slide just like this, showing some amazing panels and giving a brief summary of our findings. And then I move on, leaving the interpretations to the viewer. But there's one thing, sometimes depicted in Fremont rock art, that Paisley and I decided might relate to both our interests. And that is conflict and violence. This panel, called The Three Kings, is located in Vernal, Utah. Archaeologists agree that these figures are holding severed heads, dangling from some kind of weapon or staff. And I still can't tell you what these mean exactly or that this actually happened. I can't tell you these figures represent spirits or shaman or warriors, but it certainly invokes for me a violent message. When I look at these images, I see threats and conflict. They appear threatening. The anthropomorphic figures have weapons and shields. In some depictions, there is blood and tears associated with the decapitated heads, and often the central figures are larger than everything else, and they have sometimes been applied over top of other images, obscuring the older panels and making the figures beneath unrecognizable. Some of the figures depict what we suspect are shields, as these two from Range Creek. And then others depict actual conflicts, armed conflicts. These panels show evidence that the Fremont in this area at this time were not getting along. I can't know this for sure based only on the rock art, but when combined with other archaeological evidence, we can put together a better picture of what it was like to live during this time. Our research in Range Creek suggests that people were fighting, and it was likely over limited resources and a lack of water. On the Tavaputs Plateau, there is more evidence of conflict, including defensive-looking structures like towers on pinnacles and high-elevation residential sites. In Range Creek, there are hundreds of residential sites on the valley floor located near farmland and water where we might expect them to be. But then nearly every ridgeline has at least one site that we might call defensive or a refuge site. These sites are located 900 feet or more above the valley floor and include the full suite of archaeological features and artifacts that we find down below on the valley floor. Building and utilizing these high elevation sites would have been quite costly given their distance from water and other resources. And as you can see, we need the help of technical climbers just to access these sites and document them. Here you can see Heather Hayes, faculty in the physical therapy department, and Professor Larry Coates from the Department of Geography. And they've been helping us document numerous defensive features on top of ridgelines and pinnacles, including things like boulders perched at the access points, ready to be pushed down or shoot at people from, we suspect. And then the storage structures found throughout the Tavaputs Plateau offer more evidence that the Fremont experienced conflict over resources. We've recorded over 100 storage sites in Range Creek Canyon. The variability in the locations, shapes, and sizes of these granaries suggests that the Fremont farmers were storing maize and other wild resources using several defensive strategies. So can you all see these structures? They even, in the cliffs, sometimes had to build a platform into the cliff just to build the granary on top of. So a lot of work. The most common strategy for storing food in large, difficult to access but easy to monitor granaries above the valley floor on cliff faces or ledges. Most are located greater than 100 meters horizontally and vertically from the fields where the maize was grown that gets stored in them. These remote granaries would have been costly to build and difficult to use. This suggests the Fremont were very concerned with losing food to competitors. Storing this way made the granaries more visible from a large area where they could be monitored on the valley floor while they were conducting other activities. Despite the difficulty to access, this strategy ensured that food would be there when it was needed and was perhaps a safer bet than defending food stored at their homes on the valley floor. A second, less common strategy for storing food was to locate food in small, easy-to-access but hidden granaries. These are located closer to the valley floor, sometimes in side drainages and tucked behind boulders. The granaries appear to be more expediently made and perhaps were for storing food over a shorter period. Over the last several years, we've been gathering data on how costly these granaries were to construct and how long they kept food preserved using actualistic field experiments. Given all of this archaeological evidence for conflict between Fremont farmers in this area, we turned to reconstructing the past environment to better understand the constraints that they faced. Tree ring data shows that when the Fremont lived on the Tavaputs Plateau, the environment was much like it is now, in particular in terms of water availability, so a lot of droughts and shortages of water. So we thought, what better way to understand past human decisions in a harsh environment than to reproduce the same subsistence activities that the Fremont conducted? So, over the last few years, with the help of some very tolerant field school students, we've been building various types of storage structures of our own without modern tools. We document the time and materials it takes to build, fill them with corn, and then monitor them for erosion and break-ins by pests. And only one of our experimental granaries so far has made it to the spring with corn still in it. We'll still keep working on that. We've been timing ourselves and collecting and processing wild resources, including chokecherry, elderberry, rooseberry, and Indian ricegrass, and measuring our return rates for our efforts. And some years our returns are good, and others they are really bad. It depends on the timing and the amount of precipitation that we received that year. And lastly, we've been planting maize in our own experimental farm plots. These are designed to better understand simple diversion irrigation using only tools available 1,000 years ago, and that means sticks and rocks and bark, and we've dug these ditches with those tools. I have some of the corn out here and some of those tools, actual Fremont tools, if you want to take a look later. Our results suggest past farmers would have been reliant on irrigation water like we have been, and competition for that water would have been intense. Long periods of drought influence the availability of wild resources, they reduce irrigation potential, and they reduce our maize yields. So I've shown you some of the archaeological evidence of conflict in the past, and I've shown you our experiments that reconstruct the challenges faced. Our experiments have been really difficult, and we've been plagued by pests, droughts, floods, and more, much like the Fremont would have been. But we are not experiencing conflict and the fear of not being able to feed our families from those efforts. A scientific approach can't explain it all. Perhaps alternative approaches, such as poetry and art, might provide insights into the thoughts, feelings, and fears faced by people living in the past. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you to the museum, and thank you, Shannon, for helping me with this. I kind of went intellectually off-roading, I think, on this project. So I really struggled, actually, after meeting Shannon and looking at the research. I was so taken by it and so fascinated by it. And I thought the very first thing I would do was write about the water wars that are plaguing the West, even right now, sort of the ways in which smaller towns are sort of choking out other small towns while we all compete for the same small resources, not in any actual warfare, but, you know, economically. And then that poem died, just didn't go anywhere. And so I thought, well, I'll just write do the thing I normally do, which is a ton of research, and then I'll write about the Fremont, and that just died and went nowhere. And so I finally had to ask myself why I was so excited when I saw these images of war and conflict. And so this is a poem that actually gets to this issue a little bit. Fremont. I stand at the canyon's empty lip to study the figures, their warning and celebration of them both, image and text that rise in wide, blunt torsos like terrible shields to meet me. The heads are huge, empty, crowned with antlers and stars. The sacks I took for grain stacked by the feet become quickly not grain, but the enemy's heads. The priest, walking out to meet me over the flaming gorge with open arms, proclaims not, "Here is succor for you," but "This water is only ours." I take my pleasure in this. The ruddy stains of ochre rubbed on rock, a lick of gore time has only deepened, soaked through stone like blood on leather. I, too, looked for this. I, too, imagined such scenes, and now, seeing them hacked in stone before me, only the fact these marks have passed into science excuses my delight in them. Our first poems, too, were paeans to slaughter. Each man a flowering tree, Homer wrote, broken, the branches tamped into the sandy ground. At my feet, a crushed kit's skull, its jaw spread wide in an agonized smile. My mind, too, is a grave. And is there no way to describe such violence and not also revel in it? The bodies of the Fremont hover before me between death and life. They have no faces, no eyes, but I can see the joy their shapes still take, wide-legged, planted over the fallen. If I describe this scene to you, will you not also find something beautiful in the depiction? It's not shame emanating from that rock, though I find myself forced to turn away. Who knows what my own face looks like? If you get close, as I did, you'll see the legs of one warrior have thickened, the pale feet branching, pouring over stone like water, and how, beside him, the chieftain's hand ends in a bloody smear, shapeless, as if the artist could not bear to finish it. I have one more poem and then I'll stop. I found myself thinking more and more about the combination of poetry and science, and I started thinking about what the museum is. A museum is a space of display, and the idea of displaying science, and what is it that's going to make people actually want to see science. And I started becoming a little obsessed with the people who work in the museum, actually a lot of the volunteers. In particular, the people who are chipping away, actually, at all of the bones to present these beautiful and amazing dinosaur skeletons or copies of them downstairs. And I started thinking also about what that would mean. This is a monologue, a persona poem written in the voice of somebody who is one of these volunteer people who was, excavating these dinosaurs. And I was also thinking about still the financial crisis that we are in. So it's sort of a combination. This is called Paleo. We work in shifts. Scientists send down their burlap bowls of bone from the warehouse, plastered jackets of dinosaur haunch or skull shards hacked out from the desert, which we, volunteer retirees or 50-year-old layoffs like me, drill into, hunched in a lab breathing in 180 million-year-old smoke. We'd choke on the crusts of ancient lake beds but for the ventilators, purple nozzles thick as trunks of mastodon. Paleo, they call me at the cafeteria, where I while away my breaks archiving help wanteds and polishing my CV, savings dissolved, the house reverse mortgaged. While each Sunday, families gather behind bulletproof glass to watch me whittle away rocks with scribe and magnifier, bottom to top. I chisel out shapes I barely see from the field notes we've been given. Here are Bones regions, era, harvest date, facts, too general and specific at once for me to puzzle out, whatever mysteries I meant to deliver, enriching other reputations with my work, ours harnessed to the pistol grip of American Dream, my nickname for the red, white, and blue air-scribe pump whose airbursts can crack stone. The backbone of our museum, our head curator called it in passing, watching me wield its tungsten needle. Or did he mean me? I must admit, I lose myself in this, scribing away silt and shrouds of root fiber, worrying the box of shredded museum receipts at my feet, jacket stuffing for my finished products. If this is what clothes science, I like to joke, maybe the IRS should start funding me. At home, I fantasize of taking parts from every table and, in private, marrying the blackened hips of an Allosaurus to the needle nose of a Plateausaur, its petrified skin pebbled as the practice block on which I chipped my first drill bit. What a fabulous creature I could make, if given the opportunity, like the fabled Brontosaurus, whose head, I heard a volunteer say, never belonged to its body. A classic field mistake that still persists, preserved in our imaginations by its shape of misread menace and the childish crowds it still gathers. Who is to say this job is solely about accuracy? Perhaps mistake is science's most profitable asset, along with the museum's inherent sense of theater, proved by these lines near our model tar pits where skeletons still tear each other to bits in mock war, the glassy, saw-toothed jaw of our ticket counter's T-Rex snapping the back of a minor scavenger. If our true labor is to construct a repository of dreams, perhaps my creature might make my name, at least our museum's future. And who would find the evidence of my scheme till years later, my fraud swaddled in its soft new jacket, stacked and shelved in the warehouse to be unearthed after my death? Lost among these rows of other bones, windfall for some paid researcher to dig out from layers of burlap, toilet paper, and shredded credit cards. Thanks.
That was so fun. I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. So now we have our 4 experts grabbing a mic, getting comfortable, and we just want to have a brief conversation. I'm curious about the experience of working together, so maybe I'll start with my question, and if some of you would like to join in, that'd be great. I heard a little bit about challenges, and I'd just like to hear more about that.
Can I ask you, Paisley and Shannon?
Oh, come even further forward.
Sorry.
Oh, thanks. Oh, that's what we wanted. Thanks. Who wants to take it? My question. Oh, yep. I just want to know what it was like to work together. Were there challenges? Was it exciting? It'd be great if each one of you could briefly say something about that.
I just want to say it was tremendously exciting for me to get to work with Randy. I'd never been in the back rooms of a natural history museum like this before, and it's truly awesome. Randy's offered to give my boys maybe a tour sometime. But, I just feel like it opened up this whole new world. So for me, it was just like I was a kid in a candy store or something. I just thought it was just wonderful. So, and I just, loved working with Randy. I learned so much. I did some research on my own, but he mostly taught me stuff, so thanks.
Well, I think most academics I know, whether they're paleontologists or other fields, have a love of the arts, whether it's the written arts like poetry or visual art. So I think, I saw sort of at the high level there was a lot of common interest, but I was kind of worried, sort of at the ground level, how do we meet and produce something cohesive? But I was really surprised. I guess that's for you guys to judge, but I was really surprised how quickly we came together on sort of shared topics that we hadn't really discussed in advance. They just sort of naturally flowed together, so that was really cool, I thought. And I just want to thank both poets. They produced some really beautiful work tonight.
Is this on? Well, when Paisley and I met, we just met pretty briefly, and when we kind of talked about, neither of us knew what to do, what this was about, I said, well, let me show you this rock art. And I think once we both saw it, we kind of said, okay, that's it. And then we just split apart and mostly thought about it and worked on our own. And I thought coming together now and seeing what each one of us presented would now influence, how we go on in the future, perhaps, and how we think about it. So we didn't talk that much, and now I get to see and hear the amazing poems that she wrote. So that was exciting for me.
Yeah, I didn't utilize you nearly as much as I should have, but because I kept thinking I was going to go in a different direction, and I kept sort of changing and stuff like that. So I was like, I can't keep bothering her. But as soon as you showed those amazing pictures, I was like, okay, I know something is going to happen about that. But that question about display and violence and the ways in which image and text work together, and how poetry too has that kind of root in violence too, was something that immediately struck me. So.
Questions? We have mics. Oh, right over here.
I have a question for the poets. So is the poetry that you read tonight, is that brand new?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yes, I read one poem of Robinson Jeffers, but then the final poem I wrote for this occasion, yeah.
And how much time did you have? Right?
When did we get the assignment?
I don't know. I had a lot of time to write, but I didn't use it all. So I wrote it the last couple of weeks, So.
July, August, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We
Yeah, that's right. We met in August. Yeah, yeah.
I'm interested in the imagery that each of you pursues in your work and what you feel the overlap might be in that procedure of turning things to images.
Well, you, Bayan.
Well, I think that poets think in images quite a bit, and I think, scientists do too, I think. And so, the images, I always tell my students that, we encounter the world with our senses. Thinking comes second, So like we walk into this room and, our senses are filled. And so if we want to create a world for our reader, we have to do it through the senses. And then the thinking comes after. So that's why I feel like imagery is so important. So.
For me, I have to say there's almost no divorcing image and text. As soon as you look at a photograph or, say, the pictograph art, you start telling yourself a story. So you start immediately moving into language. And as soon as you start moving into language, you reach for another image to sort of describe, again, how you would imagine it. So I think of image and text or image and word as somehow unfairly divorced in our way of seeing the world, but it's not actually native to the way we actually work in the world. I think that we collapse these things automatically.
Shannon, did you want to say something first, Shannon? Go
No.
ahead. So,
questions for me.
I think so. Whenever I meet a little kid who wants to be a paleontologist, they ask me, what courses should I take and whatnot, and then I always disappoint them by telling them that us scientists, we're really just writers, because all of what we do comes down to communication. But on a more sort of fundamental level, when we are writing, say, technical publications, we oftentimes are describing fossils, we're describing specimens, and a huge part of that is trying to put into words what this three-dimensional object looks like, or even worse, trying to put in words what this four-dimensional past world was like. And so we have to be evocative in how we write, just like an author, whether it's prose or poetry. That's a really critical part of what we do.
Hello. So for the scientists, was there anything that the poets picked up on that sort of made you look at your respective field of study in a different way that you hadn't considered before?
Yeah, I thought that the poem that Paisley wrote about the Fremont, it really brought to me the emotion that when you're a scientist and you're out in the field, you almost forget about the people. You've got tasks to do. You've got, attention to detail. You're measuring the artifacts. You're describing the soil. You're mapping the site. You almost lose track of the people and that they, lived here. There was conflict. There was emotions. There was this fear of not being able to feed your family. And I think that I need to often center myself and think about those people and remind my students that those people lived here and they were doing these things, and we're not just looking at their trash on the ground and mapping it. We're thinking about what behaviors led to this, but also the emotions and the day-to-day lives that produced that record.
Yeah, I think a big part of what we do as field scientists, or one of the reasons why we enjoy being field scientists, I think, is, at least I do, is that moment of discovery. But I think it's very easy for us to forget that sort of the emotional joy that comes out of that moment of discovery independent of the science. And so I think talking about that and sort of this time capsule idea with Michael was really, really helpful and reminds us why we do what we do.
I guess I have the same question for the poets. Was there anything in the science research way?
Okay. I guess for me, I realized I don't really write about the past all that much. And I think this really inspired me to, I mean, I look at the history of words, etymology, but I don't really write about the past, especially the distant past. And I think I kind of realized what a rich field that is to explore. So I think that's the main thing I learned.
I think the thing that really struck me, and I wrote about it, I think, very much in the second poem, is the ways in which, and this goes back to an earlier question about image as well. I mean, scientists use metaphors all the time, right? They're actually very poetic in their thinking, because they have to be to get across these concepts. And there's something. I mean, this is a beautiful museum aesthetically; it's very pleasing. But you always take sort of for granted the display aspect of the museum and what it forces you to think about the past and how it forces you to think about the past. And that, I mean, poems do that. We're very explicit in our manipulations, and I don't mean manipulation in a bad way, but I mean, I think it is interesting how museum spaces, in the recreation, the active recreation of the past, to show these kinds of conflicts or to make the dinosaurs, scary and threatening as a way of enticing us into the museum, I think is something that we forget. Like, we forget everything that we're looking at has been very carefully chosen to give us a very particular kind of relationship to the museum. And that, to me, reminds me of the role that poetry plays. Like, we're always trying to guide you into feeling something, and to show you something you wouldn't normally want to see or know to look for.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm so fascinated with the emerging discourse about perception, about the senses, about how and where language comes in and intervenes. Shannon, when you were talking about those images, the red is pretty immediate and visceral. One thinks blood. You had to tell me that there were tears there before I saw them. And so I'm wondering about the reverse of you see something and then you begin to narrate it. In this case, because of your perception and understanding, you saw something and told me about it, and then I saw it as well. It's not exactly a question, but does anyone want to address that?
So actually, in Range Creek, the archaeological record there, everyone, thinks about archaeological sites in Utah as these spectacular cliff dwellings and really obvious features of the archaeological record. You've seen them in pictures all over. The rock art, of course, everyone recognizes that. But giving tours in Range Creek, you actually do have to point out and explain a lot of the record, especially in Range Creek. The Fremont record is not like the Anasazi ancestral Pueblo, and it's harder to recognize. The rock art's clear, but you do have to say, now these, flakes of stone are the trash that came off of a projectile point or other tool as they were making it. Or those granaries, when you're out there, once you've been there for a while, you can just see them. But when you're taking someone in for the first time, and sometimes when I'm presenting in the pictures, I point them out because I forget. Everybody doesn't know where a granary is massed in that rock and what it looks like. So it's true. A lot of the time you have to point those things out and explain their significance or even what people are looking at through descriptive language.
I would just like to say that thank you for that comment. I thought that was just really beautiful. And it just made me think of that when I was in high school and I first read Thoreau, and Thoreau talks about how by the way we live, we can actually paint the world that we see because we open our eyes wider and we see more clearly. Like if you go for a long run or you do a long hike, suddenly everything looks so bright, things look different. And, and I think for me that I didn't really have an aesthetic appreciation for the world until I started reading poetry. And that kind of opened my eyes in that way. So that's really great.
Yeah, I'll say too, I think, you can learn how to read in a literal sense, understand the words, but you sort of have to teach yourself to read, especially with something like poetry, to sort of at least start to connect with the deeper meaning that might be there. And I think that's very much the same way in paleontology and field sciences in general. You have to learn how to see. Because, yeah, you can go out there and see all the rocks and everything, but we have a lot of folks who come out for the first time, and they're struggling to see the fossils on the ground and whatnot, and they're really frustrated and thinking like, oh, I'm never going to find anything. But then gradually, you develop this new ability to see these particular details, and all of a sudden they start to pop out at you. And I think that's another sort of parallel between literature and paleontology.
Thank you all for your work and time. I thought I had an answer for the first question on the evaluation, and now I'm even more conflicted about whether I identify as a scientist or a poet. So thank you for that. And Michael, thank you so much for the language fossil connection. That was so inspiring to me. And for you and Paisley, I'm curious, has there ever been a time when you felt like you were excavating something? And can you talk a little bit about that? Digging at something, trying to uncover it.
Beside my bedroom. I guess, almost every piece of writing is an excavation for me. I don't know if you feel that way, because my first inclination is just to pour out as much language as possible and then figure out what's kind of out there, and then sort of assemble the animal from the bits and pieces that are there. So in that sense, it's very much a a kind of dinosaur seeking, expedition where I have the clues and I have to sort of figure out what really is the spine of this thing that I've created. So almost every draft becomes a kind of excavation experience. But I also write nonfiction, and a lot of the nonfiction projects I take on tend to have a lot of research. I did a book recently about a violent crime that took place in Salt Lake City, and it made me have to do a lot of research in science and in history and Asian American studies and things like that to sort of find clues to come up with why this crime happened and the meanings for it. So I guess all writing for me, from the research to the editing process, is a form of excavation.
I guess I might add that when I'm doing research for a poem, obviously there's digging to do there. And but I also feel like, I don't know if it's exactly digging, but I often feel like there's a clearing out process internally, kind of like clearing out the, the just garbage that happens in your head all the time, and kind of quieting that down, and then stuff comes, So it's kind of a digging, kind of a clearing out, I guess, that I think is important, so.
And I would just add that your process for writing sounds exactly like mine for writing technical reports. Get everything out there, every detail, and then rein it in and dig through and find all of the pieces that actually explain the important process.
I actually had sort of a question related to that for Paisley, because you mentioned that you started on a poem that in the end you sort of discarded. And I've made me think about, scientists, we often don't publish or discard sort of failed experiments, but they, in many cases, can be really valuable information. And so I'm wondering, do we have, maybe as a poet producing work now, you don't want to reveal those fragments, but do we have cases of poets and their failed poems that we can go back and sort of see how they work, things like that?
Yeah, actually, when I studied Keats, it's really interesting to see how he becomes a great sonneteer or becomes a great writer of those odes, because he used sonnets actually as a kind of structure to work on something that eventually becomes the longer ode form. And you can look at those as little chipping blocks, little practice, creatures that he's working away at. And I think a lot of poets do that. They use a kind of poem as a formal experiment that becomes something longer in some ways. So I think everything kind of gets recycled, even if not literally.
We have time for maybe one more question. Maybe last word. I don't know about all of you, but I feel like I'm seeing the world in a new way and feeling in a new way. And I hope you'll all come join us on October 24th to do this again.